What if a man's passion for preserving history sparked a battle with an entire HOA, leading to a fight for power, community change, and his own legacy? My name is Michael Turner, and 6 months ago I thought I was living the American dream. After 23 years of grinding in corporate America, climbing ladders, kissing the right asses, and sacrificing weekends for quarterly reports, I finally had enough money saved up to buy something that mattered. Not just another cookie-cutter house in a development where every lawn looks identical and every mailbox is painted the same shade of HOA-approved beige. No, I wanted something with character. Something with history. Something that whispered stories of the people who came before me. That's when I found the Hartwell property on Maple Ridge Drive in Millbrook Heights, a suburban enclave about 40 minutes outside the city. The house itself was beautiful, a restored Victorian with original hardwood floors and crown molding that craftsmen today couldn't replicate if they tried. But what really caught my attention was the barn. Standing about 100 yards behind the main house, weathered but still proud, was a 150-year-old barn that had been the heart of the original farmstead. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Linda who kept checking her phone every 30 seconds, mentioned it almost apologetically. "The barn's been there forever," she said, not even looking in its direction. "Most buyers see it as a tear-down situation. You know, clear the lot, maybe put in a pool or something more practical." Practical. The word hit me like a slap in the face. Here was a structure that had weathered storms, housed livestock, stored harvests, and watched generations of families grow up around it. It had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless seasons of change. And she wanted to call it impractical? I walked over to that barn, ran my hands along the weathered wood, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. This wasn't just a building, it was a piece of living history. The wooden beams were hand-hewn, joined with mortise and tenon joints that had been cut by someone who understood that what they were building was meant to last forever. "I'll take it," I told Linda, not even bothering to negotiate the price. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Don't you want to see the inside of the house first?" "I've seen enough." What I didn't know at the time was that I was about to learn the most expensive lesson of my life. Sometimes the things worth fighting for are the things that attract the biggest fights. The first month was pure bliss. I spent my days working remotely from the Victorian spacious home office, and my evenings and weekends in the barn, carefully assessing what needed to be done. The structure was sound, those old-timers knew how to build things, but 150 years of weather had taken its toll on the exterior. The original red paint had long since faded to a rusty brown, and several of the board and batten siding pieces needed replacing. The roof was in decent shape, but some of the cedar shingles required attention. Most importantly, the massive sliding door that served as the barn's main entrance was hanging crooked, its original hardware rusted and barely functional. I approached the restoration with the reverence of an archaeologist. Every board I removed, I labeled and set aside. Every piece of original hardware, I carefully cataloged. My plan was to restore the barn to its 1870s glory while adding modern conveniences like electricity and climate control that would make it functional for 21st century use. Maybe it would become a workshop where I could pursue the woodworking hobby I'd always dreamed of. Maybe it would serve as a unique, entertaining space for the dinner parties I planned to host. Hell, maybe I'd just use it as the world's most badass man cave. The possibilities were endless, and for the first time in decades, I felt genuinely excited about the future. I started with the foundation, carefully examining each stone and replacing the ones that had shifted over the years. Then I moved on to the siding, sourcing reclaimed wood from demolition sites to match the original barn board. Every morning, I'd wake up with sawdust under my fingernails and a smile on my face. The neighbors seemed friendly enough. A few stopped by to chat, expressing genuine interest in the project. Old Mr. Henderson from across the street had grown up in the area and remembered when the barn was still operational. My grandfather used to buy hay from the Hartwell family, he told me one evening as we watched the sunset paint the barn's weathered walls gold. That barn fed half the horses in the county back in the day. It's good to see someone who appreciates its history. Mrs. Chun from next door brought me lemonade and homemade cookies, fascinated by the restoration process. "You know, Patricia mentioned that someone was working on the old barn, but I didn't realize it was such a thoughtful project," she said, handing me a glass of perfectly sweet tart lemonade. "Who's Patricia?" I asked, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Oh, she's our HOA president. Very thorough about community standards. I'm sure she'll want to meet you soon." The way Mrs. Chen said thorough made something in my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was doing good work, honest work, the kind of project that enhanced property values and preserved history. What could anyone possibly have against that? I should have known something was wrong when I found the envelope wedged into my front door frame. Not slipped under the door, not placed in the mailbox, but wedged into the frame like someone wanted to make sure I couldn't possibly miss it. The envelope was pristine white, with Millbrook Heights Homeowners Association, printed in stern black letters across the top. My name was written in precise block letters below that, and underneath, in smaller print, were the words, "Compliance Notice, Urgent Attention Required." My hands were still dirty from working on the barn's sliding door hardware, and I left smudges on the envelope as I tore it open. The letter inside was typed on official letterhead, single-spaced, and filled with more legal jargon than a Supreme Court decision. "Dear Mr. Turner," it began, "it has come to the attention of the Millbrook Heights Homeowners Association Board of Directors that unauthorized modifications are being made to the structure commonly known as the barn on your property at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. Per Section 4.3.2 of the Community Covenant, Conditions and Restrictions (CC and RS), all exterior modifications, repairs, or improvements must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for approval prior to commencement of work." I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. Unauthorized modifications? I was restoring a historical building on my own property. What could possibly be unauthorized about that? The letter continued, "Failure to obtain proper approval constitutes a violation of community standards and may result in daily fines of $100 per day until compliance is achieved. Additionally, all work must cease immediately until proper documentation is submitted and approved." At the bottom, in the same precise block letters, was a signature, "Patricia Whitmore, HOA President." I stood there in my driveway reading the letter over and over, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Daily fines? Cease all work? I'd been working on the barn for over a month, and this was the first I'd heard about any approval process. That evening I called Linda, my real estate agent, but got her voicemail. When she finally called back 2 days later, she sounded harried and distracted. "Oh, the HOA thing," she said dismissively. "Yeah, there's some kind of homeowners association, but honestly, most of them are pretty laid back. Just submit your plans, pay the small fee, and you'll be fine." "Linda, this letter says I could be fined $100 per day. That's just legal boilerplate, Michael. Nobody actually enforces that stuff unless you're doing something really egregious. You're restoring a historical building, they should be thanking you for improving property values." But something in her voice told me she was trying to convince herself as much as me. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the evening poring over the stack of paperwork from the home purchase, looking for any mention of HOA rules or restrictions. Buried in the middle of a thick document labeled Property Disclosures was a single line, "Property subject to Millbrook Heights HOA covenants and restrictions. Current HOA fee, $85 per month." $85 a month. For what? There was no community pool, no clubhouse, no landscaping service. What exactly was I paying for? The next morning, I decided to take a direct approach. If Patricia Whitmore had concerns about my restoration project, I'd meet with her face to face and explain exactly what I was doing. Surely any reasonable person would understand that I was enhancing the property, not damaging it. I found Patricia's address in the HOA directory that had been included with my closing documents. She lived in a sprawling ranch-style house at the end of Elmwood Court, with a lawn so perfectly manicured it looked like it had been cut with scissors. Every shrub was trimmed to mathematical precision, every flower bed bordered with ruler-straight edges. When I knocked on her door, I was greeted by a woman in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of penetrating stare that made you feel like you were being evaluated for tax purposes. She was wearing a beige cardigan that matched her beige pants, and her smile was about as warm as a February morning. "Mr. Turner, I presume," she said before I could introduce myself. "I've been expecting you." "Mrs. Whitmore, I received your letter about the barn project, and I was hoping we could discuss." "There's nothing to discuss," she interrupted, stepping out onto her porch and closing the door behind her. "The rules are quite clear. All exterior modifications require prior approval. No exceptions. But I'm restoring a historical building. I'm not adding anything new or changing the character of the neighborhood. If anything, I'm preserving an important piece of local history." Patricia's expression didn't change. "The age of the structure is irrelevant. Rules are rules, Mr. Turner. When you purchased your property, you agreed to abide by our community standards. Those standards exist to protect property values and maintain the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood." "I understand that, but..." "Furthermore," she continued, "your restoration work is creating noise disturbances, dust, and increased traffic from delivery trucks. Several neighbors have complained. This was the first I'd heard of any complaints. Which neighbors? I'd be happy to speak with them directly and address any concerns. That's not your concern. Neighbor complaints are handled through proper channels, which means through the HOA board. Now you have 48 hours to submit your plans to the Architectural Review Committee. The application fee is $250, and the review process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks? I couldn't hide my disbelief. Mrs. Whitmore, I've already been working on this project for over a month. The weather's going to turn soon, and I need to get the exterior work completed before winter. Then you should have thought of that before you began unauthorized work. Her tone was final, dismissive. The barn work stops immediately. Any continued violations will result in daily fines and possible legal action. I stood there on her perfectly manicured porch, feeling like I'd just been scolded by the world's most uptight school principal. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm trying to restore a beautiful piece of history. Can't we find some middle ground here? For the first time, her expression softened slightly. Mr. Turner, I understand that you're new to the community, so let me be clear about how things work in Millbrook Heights. We have rules for a reason. When people start picking and choosing which rules to follow, it creates chaos. Property values decline, the neighborhood becomes less desirable, and everyone suffers. But, no buts. Submit your application, follow the proper procedures, and we'll review your project like any other. Until then, all work stops. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just encountered something more dangerous than a simple bureaucrat. There was something in Patricia's eyes, a cold certainty that suggested this wasn't about rules or property values. This was about power, and she wasn't about to let anyone challenge hers. Despite my growing frustration, I decided to play by the rules. I spent the next week preparing a detailed application for the Architectural Review Committee, complete with historical documentation, restoration plans, and before and after photos showing the careful work I'd already completed. The application was a masterpiece of thoroughness. I included research on the barn's construction date, architectural significance, and historical importance to the area. I documented every material I was using, every technique I was employing, and every step of the restoration process. I even included letters of support from local historians and preservation societies. The $250 application fee felt like highway robbery, but I wrote the check and submitted everything to the HOA office, which turned out to be a small room in the back of Patricia's house. Her husband, a quiet man named Robert who looked like he'd been worn down by decades of marriage to a human buzzsaw, accepted my application with an apologetic smile. "It's quite a project you're undertaking," he said, flipping through the thick folder of documentation. "My father was a carpenter, and he always said the old barns were built to last forever." "That's exactly what I'm trying to preserve," I replied, grateful to finally meet someone who seemed to understand. "Well, I'm sure the committee will appreciate the thoroughness of your application." Patricia's very detail-oriented. The way he said it made me think there was a lot more he wanted to say but didn't dare. For the next 3 weeks I waited, and waited, and waited. The barn sat half-finished, the new siding exposed to the elements, the restored sections mocking me with their incomplete beauty. Every day I'd walk out to look at it, my hands itching to get back to work. Finally, I called the HOA office to check on the status of my application. Patricia answered on the first ring. "Mr. Turner, your application is still under review. It's been 3 weeks. Your letter said 4 to 6 weeks, but I was hoping. The review process takes as long as it takes. The committee is very thorough. Can you give me any indication of when I might hear back?" "No. That's when I made my first mistake. I got back to work. It wasn't a big job, just replacing a few boards that had been damaged by the weather during the weeks of forced inactivity. I figured I'd do a couple hours of quiet work, no power tools, no noise. What could be the harm in that? I should have known that Patricia Whitmore was the kind of person who probably had binoculars trained on my property 24 hours a day. I'd barely gotten my toolbox out of the truck when I heard the sound that would change everything. Sirens. Not one police car but 3. They came screaming down Maple Ridge Drive like they were responding to a bank robbery, lights flashing, sirens wailing loud enough to wake the dead. Neighbors poured out of their houses and I stood there in my own driveway, hammer in hand, wondering what the hell was happening. The first officer out of the car was a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Are you Michael Turner?" "Yes, sir. We received a complaint about unauthorized construction work." I looked around at the 3 police cars, the flashing lights, the neighbors gathering on the sidewalk. "You called 3 police cars because I'm fixing a barn?" "Sir, we need you to put down the hammer and step away from the structure." This was surreal. I was being treated like a criminal for working on my own property. "Officer, this is my barn. I'm restoring it. I have documentation." "Sir, we need you to comply with the lawful order. Put down the hammer." I set the hammer down on my truck's tailgate, my hands shaking with anger and disbelief. "Can you at least tell me what law I'm supposed to be breaking?" The officer consulted his notebook. "Violation of community covenants, disturbing the peace, and..." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Operating without proper permits." "Permits? This isn't new construction. I'm restoring an existing structure." "Sir, that's not for us to determine. We're just responding to the complaint." That's when I saw her. Patricia Whitmore, standing on the sidewalk across the street, arms crossed, wearing an expression of smug satisfaction. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she'd called the police. The lead officer walked over to her, and they had a brief conversation that I couldn't hear. When he came back, his demeanor had changed. He was all business now, no longer the reluctant enforcer. "Mr. Turner, you're being issued a citation for violation of community standards. All work on the structure must cease immediately. Any further violations will result in arrest." "Arrest? For fixing a barn? For violating a lawful order?" I took the citation with hands that were shaking with rage. $500 fine. Court date in 3 weeks. And a warning that any further unauthorized activity would result in criminal charges. As the police cars pulled away, I stood in my driveway, looking at that citation and feeling something I hadn't experienced since I was a kid getting bullied on the playground. Complete helpless fury. But this time I wasn't going to just take it and walk away. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the smug look on Patricia's face as she watched me get humiliated in front of my neighbors. The way she'd stood there, arms crossed, like she was watching a particularly satisfying episode of her favorite TV show. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to work. Then I drove to the county courthouse and spent the entire day learning about HOA law, property rights, and the legal framework that govern communities like Millbrook Heights. What I discovered made my blood boil. The Millbrook Heights HOA was legally established in 1987, when the original farmland was subdivided and developed. The covenants, conditions and restrictions, CC and RS, were written by the developer's lawyers and designed to maintain property values by ensuring aesthetic uniformity. Every property owner was automatically a member of the HOA, whether they wanted to be or not. But here's the thing that really got me. The CC and RS were written 35 years ago and had never been updated. They were full of vague language and outdated provisions that gave the HOA board almost unlimited power to regulate anything they considered detrimental to community standards. Even more interesting was the HOA's financial structure. Every homeowner paid $85 per month in fees, which added up to over $30,000 per year from the 47 homes in the development. But there were no community amenities, no shared facilities, no landscaping services. Where was all that money going? I requested the HOA's financial records, which every homeowner was legally entitled to see. What I found was eye-opening. Patricia Whitmore was paid $18,000 per year as HOA president. The secretary-treasurer, her sister Margaret, was paid $12,000 per year. The 3 other board members each received $3,000 per year for their services. Together, the board was paying itself over $45,000 annually from a budget of $30,000. The math didn't add up. How could they be paying out more than they were taking in? The answer was in the line items, compliance fines, and application fees. The HOA was generating tens of thousands of dollars per year in fines and fees, primarily from homeowners who ran afoul of the increasingly strict and arbitrarily enforced rules. This wasn't about community standards. This was about money. I also discovered that the HOA had the legal authority to place liens on properties for unpaid fines, and had done so 12 times in the past 5 years. 3 families had actually been forced to sell their homes because they couldn't afford the mounting fines and legal fees. But the most shocking discovery was in the minutes from the monthly board meetings. For the past 6 months, the board had been discussing the problem of my barn restoration project. They'd been planning to shut me down since before I even received the first warning letter. In the minutes from April, 3 months before I received my first citation, Patricia had written, "The Turner Project sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow one homeowner to circumvent the approval process, others will follow. We need to make an example of a man trying to restore a piece of local history." That's when I realized this wasn't just about my barn. This was about power, control, and a small group of people who had turned their community into their personal kingdom. Over the next 2 weeks, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I went door to door in my neighborhood talking to my neighbors about the HOA. What I discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Mrs. Chin, who'd brought me lemonade during my first weeks of barn work, had been fined $300 for planting roses in her front yard without prior approval. The roses were beautiful, perfectly maintained, and enhanced the property's curb appeal. But they weren't on the HOA's approved plant list. I tried to fight it, she told me, inviting me in for coffee. But the fine kept growing every day I didn't remove them. Finally, I had to dig them up and pay the fine. It broke my heart. Old Mr. Henderson had been fined $500 for painting his front door navy blue instead of the approved colonial blue. The difference was so subtle that you'd need a color wheel to tell them apart, but the HOA had hired a color consultant to examine the door and declare it non-compliant. 23 years I've lived in this house, he said, shaking his head. Never had a problem until Patricia took over as president. Now it's like living in a police state. The Johnsons, a young couple with 2 small children, had been fined $200 for putting up a swing set without approval. The swing set was in their backyard, not visible from the street, and was the same model owned by 3 other families in the neighborhood. We couldn't afford the fine, Mrs. Johnson told me, tears in her eyes. We had to take out a loan to pay it off. My kids ask me every day when they can get their swing set back. Story after story, fine after fine. The HOA had become a weapon of financial terrorism, wielded by a small group of people who seemed to get genuine pleasure from making their neighbors' lives miserable. But I also discovered something else: anger. Deep, burning anger that had been festering for years but had never been channeled into action. We've all talked about it, Mr. Henderson told me. Hell, we've all complained about it. But what can we do? Patricia and her board have all the power. They write the rules, they interpret the rules, and they enforce the rules. We just have to live with it. What if there was another way? I asked. What do you mean? What if one of us ran for HOA president? The silence that followed was deafening. Then Mr. Henderson started laughing. Son, you don't understand how this works. Patricia controls the board, and the board controls the elections. They set the rules for who can run, when elections are held, and how votes are counted. It's not a democracy, it's a dictatorship with the illusion of democracy. But it's still an election, I pressed. If enough people voted for change. You'd need a majority of homeowners to vote, Mrs. Chin interjected. And most people are too scared to oppose Patricia. She remembers who votes against her, and she makes their lives hell. That evening, I sat in my half-finished barn, surrounded by the tools and materials I wasn't allowed to use, and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to run for HOA president. Not because I thought I could win, though I intended to give it everything I had. But because sometimes the most important battles are the ones you're supposed to lose. Sometimes standing up to a bully is worth doing even when you know you're going to get your ass kicked. And sometimes, just sometimes, the bully turns out to be a lot less powerful than they want you to think. The next morning, I walked up to Patricia's perfectly manicured front door and knocked. When she answered, she was wearing the same beige cardigan and the same cold smile. Mr. Turner. I trust you're not here to discuss your barn project. The citation speaks for itself. Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm here about something else entirely. I'm here to inform you that I'm running for HOA president. For the first time since I'd met her, Patricia's composure cracked. Just for a second, but I saw it. A flicker of surprise, maybe even fear. I see, she said, recovering quickly. Well, that's certainly you're right. Of course, you'll need to familiarize yourself with the election procedures outlined in the CC and RS. There are quite a few requirements for candidates. I'm sure there are. I look forward to reviewing them. The nominating period doesn't open until January, and the election isn't until March. That's assuming you meet all the eligibility requirements. Such as? Oh, there are many. You must be a homeowner in good standing with no outstanding fines or violations. You must submit a detailed platform statement for board review. You must be nominated by at least 3 other homeowners. And of course, you must attend the mandatory candidate forum. Each requirement was delivered with the precision of a lawyer reading terms and conditions. I could tell she'd had this conversation before. Anything else? The candidate application fee is $500 non-refundable. And naturally, all candidates must submit to a background check and financial review to ensure they're suitable for a position of community leadership. I smiled. Mrs. Whitmore, I've been running businesses and managing budgets for over 20 years. I think I can handle the finances of a neighborhood HOA. We'll see about that." The cold smile was back. "Good day, Mr. Turner." As she closed the door, I heard her say something to her husband that I wasn't supposed to hear. "This is going to be fun." That afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested copies of all the HOA's governing documents, financial reports, and election procedures. What I discovered was exactly what I'd expected: a system designed to prevent change. The election rules were Byzantine in their complexity. Candidates had to be nominated by 3 homeowners, but the nominations had to be submitted on specific forms that were only available during a 2-week period in January. The candidate forum was mandatory, but it was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon when most working people couldn't attend. The background check and financial review were conducted by the current board, giving them veto power over any candidate they didn't like. Most ingeniously, the voting itself was structured to discourage participation. There was no absentee voting, no early voting, and no online voting. You had to show up in person at the community center, which was actually just Patricia's garage, on election day between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. For a community where most residents worked full-time jobs, this was a significant barrier. But I also discovered something interesting. The CC&RS required that the HOA maintain a minimum reserve fund of $10,000 for emergency repairs and community improvements. According to the financial reports, the current reserve fund was $847. Where had all the money gone? I spent the next week digging deeper into the HOA's financial records, and what I found was a pattern of questionable expenditures that would make a mafia accountant blush. $8,000 for landscaping consultations, paid to a company owned by Patricia's nephew. $12,000 for legal services, paid to a law firm that had never actually provided any legal services to the HOA. $5,000 for community enhancement projects, which turned out to be new furniture for Patricia's home office. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. It was brazenly, stupidly corrupt. I announced my candidacy at the November HOA meeting, which was held in Patricia's living room and attended by exactly 7 people. The 5 board members, Mrs. Chin, and me. "I'd like to announce my intention to run for HOA president," I said during the public comment period. "I believe our community deserves leadership that's transparent, accountable, and focused on enhancing property values rather than generating revenue through excessive fines and fees." The silence was deafening. Patricia's sister Margaret frantically scribbled notes, while Patricia herself stared at me with the intensity of a snake sizing up its prey. "Mr. Turner," Patricia finally said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm. But I should point out that you currently have outstanding violations and fines. The CC&RS clearly state that candidates must be in good standing with no pending compliance issues." "I'm fighting those citations in court," I replied. "And I believe that when the facts are presented, it will be clear that my barn restoration project not only complies with all applicable regulations but actually enhances the historical character and property values of our community." "The courts will decide that," Patricia said dismissively. "Until then you remain in violation." After the meeting, Mrs. Chin approached me in the parking lot. "That was very brave," she said, "but I'm afraid Patricia's right about the good standing requirement. She's been using that rule to block potential candidates for years." "We'll see about that," I said. The next morning, I called the lawyer who was handling my citation appeal. Harold Finch was a rumpled man in his 60s who specialized in property law and had dealt with HOA disputes for over 20 years. "Michael, I have to tell you, your case is pretty straightforward," he said. "You're restoring a pre-existing structure using appropriate materials and techniques. The HOA's application process is designed to regulate new construction and modifications, not historical preservation. I'm confident we can get these citations dismissed." "How confident?" "Confident enough to expedite the hearing if you want. We can probably get in front of a judge within 2 weeks." "Do it." While Harold worked on the legal front, I launched my campaign. I printed flyers outlining my platform: transparency in HOA finances, reasonable regulations that enhanced rather than hindered property improvements, and an end to the punitive fine system that had turned the community into a revenue-generating enterprise. I went door to door again, this time not just listening to complaints but asking for support. The response was overwhelming. "You really think you can beat Patricia?" asked Mr. Henderson. "I think it's worth trying. But I can't do it alone. I need people who are willing to stand up and say enough is enough." "What do you need from us?" "First, I need 3 nominations to get on the ballot. Second, I need people to show up and vote. And third, I need people to help spread the word. Within a week, I had 17 people willing to nominate me, far more than the required 3. More importantly, I had a growing network of supporters who were ready to work for change. But Patricia wasn't sitting idle. The harassment began almost immediately. First, I received a citation for excessive noise during my campaign activities. Apparently, knocking on doors and having conversations with neighbors violated the community's noise ordinance. The fine was $100 per violation, with each conversation counting as a separate violation. Then I was cited for unauthorized signage for the small campaign flyers I'd posted on community bulletin boards. Another $200 in fines. Finally, I received a formal complaint about soliciting in the neighborhood. According to the HOA's interpretation of the CC&RS, asking for political support constituted commercial solicitation, which was prohibited without prior approval. Each citation came with the same warning: continued violations would result in daily fines and possible legal action. Patricia was trying to bankrupt me before I could even get on the ballot. The court hearing on my barn citations took place on a gray December morning in a courthouse that had probably seen more contentious divorce proceedings than HOA disputes. Judge Margaret Thornton was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who looked like she had zero patience for petty neighborhood squabbles. Harold had prepared a comprehensive defense, complete with historical documentation, photographs of the restoration work, and testimony from local preservation experts. But the most powerful evidence was visual before and after photographs that clearly showed the barn's transformation from a weathered, deteriorating structure to a beautifully restored piece of local history. The HOA's attorney, a nervous young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, presented their case with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. His argument basically boiled down to, rules are rules and Mr. Turner broke them. Your Honor, Harold said during his opening statement, this case isn't about rule breaking. It's about the difference between preservation and destruction. My client isn't building something new, he's saving something old.